we're going to have a discussion in the framing of programming. And the framing is going to be kind of like differentiating resistance versus load. Okay. And to give people more context, the next founders meeting is going to be on essentially resistance. Okay. And what we're going to do is because we just had a founders meeting on oscillatory isometric muscle actions. And and a lot of the founders meetings, what we kind of learn is people continue to ask about resistance without knowing that they're asking about resistance. So
Hmm.
so resistance is something that the Soviets first graded out. Okay. So let me just kind of define the context of how the Soviets graded out resistance.
Hmm.
Okay. And then we'll kind of open up like resistance, like what is the difference between resistance and load? So the Soviets, if you think about it, in the sport of Olympic weightlifting, they had to be able to control the volume of the work that they were doing. Okay.
Okay.
And so how they ended up doing that is they graded out like, hey, if you can do this many reps, then that resistance is graded out to mean this. And so I'll just go through some like very specific examples. Like if you're
Okay.
using a resistance that permits for only one repetition or one effort to occur, the resistance is considered, I almost said load, but the resistance is considered maximal. If it permits for 2 to 3 reps, it's submaximal. If it permits for 4 to 7, it's heavy. Okay, heavy resistance, and then it goes all the way up to 25 or over. So if the resistance permits for 25 reps or more, it's considered very light. Okay, and the reason why I want to say this is because like this is programming, but the programming gets muddy with the Soviets because they were practicing the lift, but they were also training,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? And that's what enabled them to say like, hey, we're just going to take submax weight. So we're just
Hmm.
going to do submax weight, and we're just going to work on like the bar path and what the Soviets would call technical mastery of the lift, right? Like, hey, is the bar moving at the optimal speed that it has to move? Because if it moved too fast, it would deteriorate the skill of moving the barbell, right? So obviously, when like the intent becomes how does the barbell move through space at what velocity, at what path, at what biomechanics, all this other stuff. Now we're starting to discuss practice, and that's practice. And so you can see that the Soviets needed a way where they could constrain the amount of resistance so that they would get the neural output that they wanted in bar path, bar speed, etc. Right? Execution of the lift, right?
Okay.
Okay, and then that's when you see Perlipin's chart come in, and they're like, "Hey, this is how we're going to really start to practice." And then that practicing of the lift is what led to them getting beat by the Bulgarians, right? Because the Bulgarians were more about neural output and essentially like scaling up the nervous system than they were about about technical mastery. They didn't really care about the technical mastery, right? Okay,
Hmm. Hmm.
and so then when you look at like Louis Simmons blended both the Bulgarians and the Soviets, so he used a combination of two of them in regards to how he would program resistance. So that's why like if someone on like like let's say that Louis would have somebody doing speed strength, they would be
Hmm.
using a submaximal resistance, which would be 2 to 3s. And
Okay.
that's why like you would hear Louis talk about, hey, the resistance is submaximal, but the intent is highest attainable speed, velocity. You
Okay.
with me on like how he would be able to program that from from that
Did he?
standpoint?
Yes. And so, how does load fit into that? Maybe you're going to get into that.
So so resistance is different than load,
Okay.
right? Because resistance is how if you're programming something for someone, right? Like
Hmm.
we did a thing with Justin Compton,
Hmm.
right? And Justin Compton, who's insanely high level bodybuilder, won the Arnold Asia,
Hmm.
right? Like and
Hmm.
other pro shows as well, right? But like he would say, like, hey, the reps that I want is I want you to be between 8 and 15. Okay, well, you can see that's like moderately heavy resistance if it was a Soviet system. He's essentially saying, like, hey, I want you to be like at a moderately heavy or moderate resistance, right? And like I said, we'll go through all the specifics of this in a founder's meeting, right? But that's resistance, but the resistance is not technically the load.
Okay.
And it gets more complex because let me just say this, because once you usher in accommodating resistance, which is resistance and it's external, then what ends up happening is the when you're doing percentage based training off of a training max, right?
Hmm.
And like let's say that normally you would put like 50% on the bar. So let's say that your training max is 300 pounds in a bench press and
Hmm.
you want to start to train like speed strength,
Hmm.
right? What you would do is you would take a percent, let's say it's 50% just to make it easy, because then that puts
Hmm.
it at 150 pounds. But the thing
Hmm.
is, so 150 pounds is going to be at 50%. But the thing is that 150 pounds, it doesn't have to be all straight plate weight. You can actually like start to remove weight and put band tension on there, right? That's one of the things that like George Halbert and like all those guys at Westside were able to really do is tinker with resistance so that they could get different outputs,
Right.
right? And obviously that's stuff that we'll go into, right? But like what we were kind of discussing is the fact that resistance is different than load, and load seems to be like the cumulative thing that the neural network of absolute strength actually like outputs, like the amount of the total work.
Okay. So getting back to that example, so that means that 150 pounds on the bar plus the accommodating resistance
Mm-hmm.
would be the would be the total resistance for that lift. Is that correct?
Yeah, so like let's say so to be even more specific with that, because this is where there's like a lot of programming variance and you can get ultra creative, which I highly suggest people do because you want to avoid neurological stagnation when you're obviously doing speed strength training. So one of the things that you can do, so you're talking about 150 pounds. So let's say that you wanted to make that 70%. So you could make it 50% of straight weight and then 20% of band tension, which would then put you at 70%.
And that 70% right
Resistance
there
is
is
resistance.
is resist because that would determine. So what you're saying then is that resistance would ultimately then determines the speed of the lift and therefore the repetitions that can be performed.
Yes, for sure. It's going to constrain that for sure.
Okay. And then what we're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I think I heard this. So then what you're saying then is once you've determined that, so you've determined the resistance, which then determines the lift, the total amount of work done, maybe that's not the right word, but like the speed at which the lift is done at and the amount of repetitions done for that lift is what is then called the load.
And that's what I think. That's what I think because as we delve deeper into resistance, like to me, resistance is external, right? And so like there requires there to be an external like external resistance. Like that's what they're talking about. Like how much can you do that permits for you to do reps within a 4 to 7 range? Like can you do repeated efforts and then right like that's resistance. That's how when I'm programming for people, I'm programming him and I'm telling them, listen, on this specific thing, I want you to be able to do 4 to 7. Why do I want you to do 4 to 7? Well, I can get very specific as, and that's what we'll do in the meeting, right? Is it would be like, well, I want you to train against heavy. against heavy resistance, and I want you to get to near failure or to failure within 4 to 7. Why? Because that amount of resistance constrains the neural network of absolute strength to figure out where are the large, fast twitch muscle fibers that move heavy resistance repeatedly for this amount of time under tension, which then that's going to create more like you'll get a little bit of strength effects, but you get a lot of hypertrophy as well. So you're kind of like tapping into both. When you start to go to like 8 to 12 or start to get up a little bit higher, it's less neurological and more biological, let's say, right? But that shows from a programming standpoint how the resistance, one, constrains the neural network to find whatever specific biology you want from a musculature standpoint, right? And then when you do the entire composite of like that set, that's what then creates the load, because then you have to layer in intent over that, right? Like intent is going to be a part of that. Effort's going to be a part of that.
So when you're, if you were to tell me to do an exercise, the amount of weight that I would do that exercise with,
Resistance.
plus band tension or not,
Yeah.
is what you would determine to be resistance
Yes.
based on Soviets.
Yeah. I feel like the Soviets had the simplest way to program, and obviously like they were the first ones to distinguish the difference between programming and training, right? And if you look at like all of the methods that came out of there, your max effort method, your dynamic effort method, your repeated effort methods, right? Like all of the logic that came out of there is essentially what has enabled, programming to occur that breaks like huge stagnation phases. Because think about it, like that's the logic that Louis used, right? Like he
Okay.
used,
So to finish that thought then, so let's say that you gave me an exercise that involved 50 pounds of just straight weight. So there's my resistance,
yep,
correct? Okay.
yep,
I do 3 sets of 6 repetitions of that.
yep.
Okay. So there's 18 repetitions.
Mm-hmm.
And so 18 times 50 would be my load
Mm-hmm.
that I moved during that particular. Am I correct?
I think you're correct. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, from a programming perspective, that's how, that's how
So I would
pro,
have moved roughly 900 pounds.
yeah. Because that's how I start to figure out too, like, okay, well, how much load is going through that tissue? That's what enables me to like just look at the training to be like, okay, if this training is going as necessary, that means that this program is getting you this. Like that's how you can easily reverse engineer it, right? Like if you have a bodybuilder and they're doing like only 19 to 25, it's like, listen, you're not going to hypertrophy the tissue that's needed to like win competitions using lightweight. Like you got to use heavyweight, you got to use moderately heavy resistance. Like you have to use resistance that permits there only to be certain amount of repeated efforts until you get to failure.
So resistance then, using uh, in the way that we're discussing it, resistance is kind of like the strain rate that the lift is causing the lifter.
I would agree with that. I would very much agree with that. I
Okay.
th- I
And
think
so,
I think I think sorry to interrupt, but I think that makes it
yeah.
much more complete and much more coherent.
Okay. Because because what what you're saying within the realm of resistance here is based on the grading that the Soviets gave us, is that a certain amount of resistance should elicit this many repetitions, depending on whether it's high resistance or moderate resistance or low resistance. And so
Mhm.
from a trainee perspective, the athlete or the person who's going to undergo that resistance, that is going to determine how much they strain during the performance of that exercise.
Mhm.
Correct?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just trying to think about it in different terms that may align with with more like a biological, more from like a biological way or a neurological way.
Okay,
And so
let me
based on the yeah,
go for it.
so based on that, so that determines like the strain rate. The strain rate determines the signal that is put into the athlete as a result of the lift.
Yeah.
And so if the strain rate is high, sorry, if the resistance is high, so therefore the athlete is going to strain a lot, that actually skews the the signal to more neural network.
Correct.
And if the strain rate is lower, therefore permitting more repetitions, that resistance would skew more the biological network.
100%.
Okay.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. That's an interesting link that you made. Yeah, that's 100% because think about it. Can I give a very specific level of competition
Yeah, of
example?
course. Of course. We're
Okay.
just for those that are listening to this, this is just a sort of a brainstorming discussion on like how we can maybe more accurately help define these terms within the absolute strategy.
For sure. Okay, let's say that you have an NFL lineman. Okay. So 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 when you look at blocking as a special strength, right? So like the ability to run or pass block, the nervous system has to generate a magnitude of force and discharge it in a very special way to make that block. Okay. Now the load that is or the resistance that they're going to go up against is going to be like how much is does the actual lineman weigh and then like how much can they generate, right? So let's just think about now just the resistance. So like let's say like Olin was telling me he used to have to block Ted Washington, who was like, well over like close to 400 pounds, if not more.
Mhm.
Okay. Does that make sense? So like if so the the resistance that he's going to go up against is that. And so the more that he goes up against that, right, the more biology he starts to develop to do that because he's going to have to do that for like 60 to 70 times a game. So that's the load, right?
60 to 70 times 400 is the load.
Yeah, right. And you got like 40 seconds in between plays if it's like a drive, but then like how like the like how many reps you have to do or like let's say repeated efforts you have to do and like it's going to be over we know it's going to be over the course of like 4 hours, let's say, right? But like
Mhm.
over the course of that would be the amount of load that the lineman essentially ended up doing in that game, and you would need to know that from a programming perspective so that
Sure.
then they can repeatedly essentially go against that resistance to then generate like the actual strength that they need to create the block. So then we know in off-season programming, they need to be able to move. They have to be able to physically displace this amount of resistance repeatedly on demand. And then you're programming everything to make sure that, hey, by the time the season comes around, like that is a, like it's just a behavior of the neural network, and they can handle that type of loading from that type of resistance.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. That makes that logical progression makes sense for sure. So so let me ask you a question, and this I hope this is not a stupid question. Would you ever program based on the total load?
Oh, I see what you're saying. See, that's the thing. That's a great question because, yeah, I mean,
Okay.
of course, right? Because like that's what we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that their nervous system, if we go back to like load as a neural network output, we want to make sure that the neural network can output essentially like force at that level to be able to do that blocking, right? Because then what ends up happening, if you think about like in season phase, if you think about training camp, like then what you see is a lot of times the nervous system can continue to do it, but the biology, the strain is too much. Because that's why you
Mm.
see like the biology starts to break down. So it's like the nervous system can still like that's that neurological to biological asymmetry. And like
Hmm.
that's what like in the programming of the lineman, that's kind of like the edge that you're always trying to kind of blur is you're trying to get them to be able to like output that load of the neural network, but kind of at like less resistance, if that makes sense, so that the biology is like always compounding and continue to catch up. And then that's the reason why as well, like that's the reason why you have to get really creative with how the types of resistance that you're using with the linemen so that you
Hmm.
one don't drive neurological stagnation trying to get the loading outputs, but then two you don't drive biological accommodation from the straining outputs. So you're always that's why I feel like with resistance there's so much that the programmer can do to put the trainee into the position so that like you're kind of like riding the line where it's like you're saying like over here is more strain and tissue and over here is more neurology, and you're just kind of trying to like be in between that edge, like what we would call the conjugate edge, where it's like top down, bottom up, and then there's like that middle part where like the two are synergizing to give you the emergent behavior. You kind of want like your programming of load to be there, where it's like moving up and down and fluctuating, where it's like, hey, it's higher neurological here, now more biological here, right? And how can you do that? Well, how you can do that is through like other things, like I don't want to like distract the conversation from resistance, but how you would do more biological things is you would do we would call it more practice than technically training, because we would be more concerned about how the lineman is organizing themselves to make the effect happen. But it would be like tunch punches, where it's like now they're doing tunch punches, but they're doing them for like 19 to 25 reps, right? Why is that? Because like they're just punching a bag and it seems like there's no resistance, but there is resistance. But the resistance is so light according to the Soviet grading scale that then they can get 19 to 25. But now they were able to get 19 to 25 where they get the stress stiffening in that tissue, the damping into that tissue, all these other like very nuanced things that we're also like weaving in to the
Hmm.
programming, which would fall technically under load. Because think about it. Let me be a little bit more specific. So, like, let's say that you're doing like a pass pro drill where they're punching, but when they punch, they're trying to dampen. So it's punch and dampen, punch and dampen. Well, the dampen is an intent, and that creates a unique load of the top down nervous system, essentially doing a PIMA into the bag of pressing isometric to tune all of that tissue, which skews it towards the biological side. Like there's a neurological component of being able to do that, right?
Hmm.
But it's so the resistance is so minimal that it can output like 19 to 25, which then puts it in a category where you go, hey, this is on a recovery day, and this is probably a recovery day for like the nervous system or like a deload day, whatever you want to call it, right? But then that would essentially go in a biological category, and now, hey, we have this thing that is building, the programmable ability to dampen at moment of impact, but it's also tuning the connective tissue so that the dampening behavior gets better because the nervous system has better white tissue that then can better dampen bottom up on its own and therefore needs less top down.
Well said. Well said. Interesting discussion. Interesting discussion for sure.
Yeah, so I guess what we will say is like for people to leave their questions on resistance and load, and then eventually, like, I guess we'll just work this thing out for the next founders meeting and hopefully have like an open discussion where we get a little bit more clarity.
Yeah, I think I mean I think this topic is one where like oftentimes these terms resistance and load are used interchangeably. Um, and I think what we're trying to highlight and what we will continue to highlight in that founders meeting is that they are distinct. They should not be used interchangeably, and they mean different things. And again, based on our strategy, which has historical roots, how can we take those historical roots, maybe update them a little bit, bring them into you know the where we are right now in terms of training science and training knowledge, and implement them more specifically and appropriately into the absolute conjugate strategy so that from a programming perspective it's very well defined. This is what resistance is, this is what load is, this is how we use it. Ultimately, if we have this resistance and this loading, it sends this signal, so on and so forth.
Yeah, perfect.